There we go. Welcome Nii Parkes as our special guest for our 5th online book club, where we will be discussing The Gaze. Just a little bit about Nii Parkes. Nii Parkes is a Ghanaian-British writer and editor who has won acclaim as a children's author, poet, broadcaster, and novelist, winner of multiple international awards, the ACRAG award. His novel Tale of the Blue Bird won France's 2 major prizes for translated fiction, Prix Baudelaire and Prix Le Bataillon in 2014. Nii is the founder of Flipped Eye Publishing, a leading small press, serves on the boards of World Literature Today and the AKO Caine Prize, and was chair of the judges for the 2020 Commonwealth Prize, currently producer of literature and talks at Brighton Festival. I don't think that's updated, but he is the author of 2 collections of poetry, The Makings of You 2010 and The Gaze 2020, both published by Peepal Tree Press. So again, welcome Nii, really excited to have you here. To engage in discussion with you on the collection. I believe you'll be reading for us, and we'll have an opportunity for our attendees to ask you a few questions. So I'm going to get stuck in, and I guess ask you about the title. When I first saw the title, I pronounced it as Geese, as in geese, but it is in fact The Gaze, as in gaze. In the blurb, the collection is described as the blurred lines between what is seen and what is. Let's talk a bit about titling, your choice of titling. Do you think titles are important?
Yeah, I think titles are very important. Well, for me, I think at the foundation of every writing experience is fun. So for me, I write work which is accessible, but at the same time contains a lot of play for me as the writer. So many layers of meaning, many ways of interpretation, which are meaningful for me. And I guess for people who engage with the work a little bit more, might find layers, I mean, it's like a game. So The Gaze is very important because it reinforces the idea of what is seen and what is, right? So you look at it and you think, geez, right? And that's because you inhabit a certain way of pronouncing these letters. But in another language, the same letters sound different, right? But also, Gaze is one of the oldest languages, scripts that's used for Amharic, for instance. So, so I'm playing, and it also we're talking about, the photograph. It's what are you seeing in there in the shadows? What's there? What's not there? And the the whole thing of what in the West. I mean, I grew up in Ghana, so I'm very comfortable in my skin, but I'm also aware of how my skin is politicized in this space. So the gaze on me, when I come here, I actually feel it. I literally feel a weight off me when I arrive in Ghana, because I know I'm not going to be judged in the same way walking down the street. So the title embodies all of that just by the fact that it looks different from the way it's pronounced. And also that reinforces the cover, which can just be shadows. And even when you do see it as a body, it's not a body in the way that somebody would expect it to be a body of a grown-up, because then now it's the body of a baby, it's in a fetal position. So there's all of those things that I'm playing with. Oh, Barbara, there's nothing to be embarrassed about. Yeah, so titles are very important for me.
Thank you for that. answer, that detailed answer. I guess I'm going to ask you about, you mentioned languages. The gays contain several languages, so correct my enunciation. I've avoided trying to pronounce your middle name because I
It's
just
Ayikwei.
Ayikwei. Okay,
Yeah.
Nii Ayikwei Parkes. Okay, so the collection contains 7 languages. So is it Ga?
Ga.
Ga, Spanish, French, and English. You're multilingual, I believe.
Yes. I mean, so I speak 3 Ghanaian languages, French, English, a little bit of Spanish. It's not great, but I won't get lost in Spain. Yeah, and then I've got bits of different things. And then, of course, I speak Pidgin English, which is its own language. You know, just as, you know, I think the world must recognize that all of the Englishes of the Caribbean are different languages. You know, the tenor of expression is different from English that is spoken in England. Even within England, it's only recently that the language has become standardized. And that's related to radio and television and, you know, what we call received pronunciation. But when I went to university, for instance, I had people who came from London who used to ask me what people from Newcastle were saying. And because I grew up in a country with many languages and I'm used to listening to accents, I could always hear everyone. But the English people, which was the surprise, actual English people couldn't understand each other sometimes. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. There's an incorporation of scientific terminologies that you've referred to as Ghanaianisms, neologisms, alliterations. For example, in your first novel, Tale of the Bluebird, you stated that Ga provided you with the foundation of dreaming. Can you talk a little bit about, I guess, the value of languages? You've touched upon, you know, being able to decipher various accents.
Yeah. Well, you know, the thing about languages is sometimes we think of them as just a format, but languages are also philosophy. And this is one of the reasons why the languages of the Caribbean are different. The English language of the Caribbean is different from the language of English because they carry philosophies with them, whether they're, you know, we're consciously thinking about them or not, that inform the way that we use language. So if I'm thinking in Ga and talking in English, the way in which I'm going to structure things are different because the things that are of value within my language and culture are not the same things that are of value within a different culture. So that's why you can take a Russian person and teach them English and they'll speak English, but the way in which they'll approach the language will be connected to the culture that they grew up in. You know, the nature around us informs how we form metaphors, how we compare things. The way in which we've related to light in our entire life will inform how much we describe or don't describe light. One of the things that as an editor I find really amusing is every time I get somebody who's written about the Caribbean or Africa, I can tell if the person is white or if the person grew up there. Or if the person's from the West, it's not even white. If the person's from the West or if the person grew up there, by just how much they emphasize color. Because the people who grew up there, there's color around them all the time. So they don't keep going on about it's colorful, it's colorful, it's colorful, right? Because it's the baseline. So it's all of these things. So this is also to say that language goes beyond just the words. It's when we talk about our vocabulary, it's our philosophical vocabulary, it's our emotional vocabulary, it's our environmental vocabulary, it's our vocabulary of pain, inherited pain, all of the traumas, all of those things are part of our language. The things we avoid speaking about are also part of our language, because our silence is also part of language. So it's a very complex thing. And the job, I think, of the poet is to navigate and manipulate these things to get as close to the meaning that they're trying to get across as possible. Because the thing about language that's also beautiful is that it can never fully express what we feel. We're always reaching. And so that, for me, is the dynamism of any kind of storytelling, is that there is an element of stretching all the time.
Thank you, Nii. Could you talk a little bit, I guess, about the strengths of the various languages that you speak as a writer, maybe the limitations that they might, you touched upon, colors, being able to identify whether someone grew up in the continent, in Africa, or is from the West. Would you say there are any limitations or?
Yeah, I think every language has its limitations because, as I said, every language embodies a philosophy and a vocabulary that is about its environment. So for instance, Ga, my language doesn't have a word for snow. Why would we? Right? So that's a weakness. If you arrive somewhere and the problem was snow, how do you express that in Ga? Right? So that's those are some of the things. But then again, God doesn't have any words, doesn't describe human beings as Black. So I can't be Black in my own language. I can be dark, but I can't be Black. So that's another dimension. There's a protection in that. You think about of all the Aboriginal languages that have been studied in Australia, none of them have a word for in front of or behind, because in their language, because they navigate so much, they're very precise about cardinal points. So they'll say to the north of, to the south of, to the east of, to the west of. There's no behind or in front. So a phrase like behind every successful man cannot exist in their language. So suddenly this thing which puts women in the background can't exist in the language. So this is why I devour languages, because I just feel like every language gives you something. Like the title Oscura y sus obras, right? The technically correct way to say that, to write that, would have been Oscuridad y sus obras, which would be darkness and its works. But Spanish allows me to say dark, the dark and its work. And so it's a deliberate misuse of the language, but it's a misuse I could only really use in that language, because in English, it wouldn't carry, it's these intangible weights that languages have, and it wouldn't carry the same in English. So yeah, I mean, languages are beautiful. So I find refuge in my language. I think the first time somebody racially abused me on the streets of London, I was really mad. And I could feel like something violent coming. And then when I had time to think about it, I thought to myself, well, it's not even my language. So anybody says anything, I'm just going to ignore it. And since then, I've been able to keep an even keel. It doesn't mean that what they're doing is not abusive, but I have the armor of a different language. And I think this is where, and I'm very interested in, I have family roots in the Caribbean and in America. So I have pretty much the triangle. That's why I have an English surname, right? So my great-great-grandfather came from Jamaica. He was a Maroon into Sierra Leone. And then my grandfather migrated to Ghana. So by that accident, I'm Ghanaian. However, one of the blessings I think that I've had, and like families like Margaret Busby's, if you know who Margaret Busby is, again, of the Caribbean, is that when you end up on the continent, you then get another language through which to interpret or explore these histories that have been conferred upon us. So people have done things to us, and then they've written about it in a way that makes it seem like they've done good things to us, when in our bodies, we know they've done bad things to us, right? And yet we can only inhabit that language and that history if that's all we have. So the dialogue between the Africa and its diaspora needs to be ongoing, because these are the ways in which these healings happen. Because, so for someone like me, I carry, so to speak, a slave name, but I ended up with a language that is not of the enslaver or the abuser. And so through that, I'm able to kind of unpick the kind of deception of, history in that language.
Thank you for that detailed answer. I think you were eavesdropping at our discussion. Maybe not. Maybe I'm wrong.
Oh no, I was in the kitchen.
Okay, you've
What happened?
We had a particular question about African diasporas, particularly the African American influence in African diasporas, and I kind of mentioned, I guess, the distinction between, I guess, Black Britishness, which came into fruition quite recently in the past, say, 5 years or so, in comparison to the African American experience. And I guess touching upon the debates online, particularly Twitter, the beef, if you will. Yeah, is there anything that you could kind of comment or develop about that? Do we, as an African diaspora, and I'm mainly talking about the UK, have a lot to learn from African Americans' experiences in terms of equity versus equality? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, all of these experiences are very different. And the reason why I say the dialogue is ongoing is because we can learn from each other. Now, if you look at the relationship with Britain, the people who have come into Britain, some of them are double identified outside of Africa. So would have been in the Caribbean, which is similar to the African Americans, except that the Black people are a majority. But this is actually true in certain spaces in the United States. So the United States is very complex. So there are spaces in the United States where there are Black majorities. So when you talk about the Geechee people in Louisiana, they've had that experience, and you can tell in how the culture moves, right? And even in the Caribbean as well, there are spaces in which there are white majorities. So it depends on where somebody comes from, the experience. And then you take that transplant of people being told this is your mother country, and then coming to that and then being rejected. So in that rejection, they're sending you back to a place that you were forced to in the first place. I mean, if they could, obviously they weren't able to, but verbally, go back, go back, go back. But it's kind of like, go back to where you forced me to in the first place. What does this mean? So there is that. The African-American experience is these are brothers who have seen other people dispossessed of their land. And if you look at substance abuse in places like South Africa, in Australia, and with Native Americans in America, you see what the wound is of people who are dispossessed of their land and yet live on it. You can chalk it, people just say, oh, they're not much. No, can you imagine what it's like? It must be like to watch somebody take something that's yours and walk past you every day, and you can't do anything. These are like, and so the African-American experience, and you have to remember that African-Americans sometimes are also partly First Nation people as well, because there were marriages and people, but they witnessed this happen, right? And then so the people who had the land were dispossessed, and they who came as dispossessed were never given anything. And yet the country is built on their sweat and blood. So that's a whole, and we are now beginning to see that here, where you have generations where they're doing the work, the country is moving forward, they're celebrating things that have been invented and worked on by Black British people. But when we talk about Britishness, as the saying goes, no Black in the Union Jack, right? So so what can we learn from the American experience? How can we kind of navigate better? Do we navigate? Do we choose not to navigate? There are all of these things. So it's a very, very complex, dynamic, and eternally fascinating for us, if for no one else. Yeah, I don't know if that's a circuitous. I go on these tangents because that's how my brain works.
No, not at all. Thank you for giving us that insight. I guess I'm going to move slightly off from this topic, and I guess talk about your creative process. You use a particular poetic form that you in fact devised yourself. When I Google the gimbal, it's some sort of, in the English language, is a camera device, I believe. Correct me if I'm wrong.
That's the second iteration of it, but it inherits from part of a gyroscope, because a gimbal helps the camera stay steady.
Okay.
Right. So in the same way that the gyroscope has gimbals to keep it steady, now there are gimbals with cameras, because you have these moving cameras when they're doing films and stuff, and they help to keep the camera from rocking while it's filming. So that's the second iteration of it. But yeah, same principle. And the form, you know, came out of experimentation or trying to breathe. It's essentially a kind of, so the first poem I wrote in the form was I'm gonna, of serendipity, right? And it references a gyroscope in that. Now, what happened with that poem is I was trying to write about my grief, and I just couldn't find the right balance. And I just started playing around, and I found this form, which actually, when I created the form before I theorized it. And this is how all forms emerge. So sometimes we're bamboozled by this thing. It's like, oh, sonnet this, sonnet that. But actually, it was just some kids messing about. They came to something, and then the rules were made. And then now we have to stick by them, like we have no thought or autonomy. And so I take the same freedom in finding ways to express myself how I need to. Now, when you lose someone in Ghana, and I believe this is the same in the Caribbean as well, you stay at home and you receive visitors. So they come, and you tell them about what's happened. So what tends to happen, you go through this process of repeatedly saying how you've lost something. And after a while, you become numb, and you're just saying it. But what I found that this form represented was, for me, something that felt like the first time I had to speak of having lost. And in this case, it was my grandmother, which is to say that there's a kind of flurry, an outburst, and then you pause. And then it's almost like when you cry, you cry frantically, and then, I mean, the body needs breathing, so you have to pause. And then, there's a little kind of hiccup phase, or like a line of realization. And then you go into it again, and then you pause. So the gimbal is structured exactly like that. It's 5 lines, a pause, a single line, a pause, 4 lines, a pause, a single line, a pause, 4 lines, a pause, a single line, a pause, and 5 lines. And those are breathing spaces, because it's too much to all come out at once. And the other thing that I realized was I couldn't lead with emotion, because then I would become incoherent. So that process of repeating is kind of where the kind of the transition happens from logic to emotion. Because when you are repeating these things to people, you are just going through the motions. When they leave, you are reminded you are now alone. The person that you were speaking of is not there with you. The visiting hours are over. You're left with your emotions. And that's that transition. So I think of it as something like if a doctor was trying to save their own parent's life, what they would be doing initially is very technical. It's like, I'm doing this, I'm doing this, I'm doing this, I'm doing this. And at some point when they've lost them and they say, well, they lost so much blood and we couldn't save them, at that point, there'll be a pause and a realization of, oh, this is my mother. And then what do they say after that? And that's the turn right in the middle where it goes from, I'm describing this thing, but actually this is really hurting me and I need to express that. And so that's the gimbal. So after I managed to write it in that way, I then kind of looked at the structure. I looked at why does it work for me? How come this feels right? And that's how I came up with that. And then I tried to write other poems in that form. And I realized that I could write about more than just grief. I could write about joy as well. In the same way, sometimes you come and you're excited because something's happening. You're like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And then you pause, it's like, oh yeah, but you know, and then same way. So I feel like the gimbal is a very human form, at least in the way I express myself.
Thank you. Thank you for that really detailed and interesting answer. I find that in your writing, you're constantly evoking imagery that I'm really able to just kind of close my eyes or just, like you said, take a breather or put, you know, the collection down and feel, which kind of leads me to my final multi-barrel question about the performance of poetry. I actually just wanted to ask you what genres of music you're into and whether you listen to the new Kendrick Lamar.
I haven't listened to it yet because I want to make space for it. So I'm a music binger, right? So I listen to music all the time, and it depends on how I feel on the day. And I'm not, you know, I'm not very picky. Like the last couple of days, I've been listening to like just kind of lovers rock. So like old, you know, music from the Caribbean, Dennis Brown, that type of thing, just because I was in the mood. And very often I have playlists as well, you know, that I'll get into sometimes. I play a lot of jazz, play a lot of blues. But if there's a new album that I want to listen to, what I tend to do is I will run a bath, I'll turn off the lights, and I'll just listen and get into it. So when I feel like I really want to get into an album, I make space for it. I don't just like go and delve. So I'm making space for Kendrick. I'm gonna go and listen, and I'll let you know.
Great, good to know. So clearly musicians and music inspire you. Is that the case? Well, it evidently is.
Yeah.
Particularly Zest, when performing poetry, how do you implement that? How are you inspired by that, you know, music that you initially wind down to? And then I guess the last part of this question is, do you think the art of spoken poetry has been lost in some ways? What I'm mainly referring to is, I guess, spoken word in universities, you know, there's always a kind of pump and like, yeah.
Well, I mean, again, I think it's about perspective. For me, one of the reasons why I love language is because I think language is music, right? This is why we have accents. In the same way, no two guitarists will play the same song the same way. Nobody is going to phrase a baby like Aretha, you know? It's the same word, it's just a word, but the way Aretha will get from the first syllable to the second syllable is completely different. So I think language is music. And I think that the debate that's been manufactured about the page versus the stage is really about entitlement. We are in a language culture where much of the early writing was done by elites. That's just the reality. These are people who were used to being listened to. So when they came and they sat down, they wanted everyone to be quiet and they could read however they wanted to read. I come from a culture where if you have something to say, you better make sure it's interesting enough for somebody to listen. So I come to my audience with that respect of, hey, I know you're making time for me, and so I'm in dialogue with you. And I think if you forget the dialogue aspect, then you are not sharing. The moment you're sharing, that's what we call performance. The moment we're sharing, it's not about how loud or what theatrics you do. It's about conversation. It's about am I in conversation with this audience? So if you see somebody and they're just like this, there is no conversation with the audience. And yes, they might not be able to say it off the page, but at least look up, say something, right? Have that dialogue and begin, and then you're fine. So I think it's a false divide. It's all about entitlement. I often say to people, England is a place where people have the worst spatial awareness in public. And that's not even about rhythm or anything like that. Again, it's just entitlement. Like, people just think you're going to move out the way. Like, I can walk and I don't bump into anyone. I'm like, how is it you are just bumping into people? So there are a lot of things that are phrased as cultural battles or debates or whatever, but actually are really about the fact that in the last 200 years, the working classes have become literate, are expressing themselves, and the elite classes don't know how to handle it. This is even without bringing race into it. You know, because when you bring race into it, it's a whole different dynamic. You know, I was writing on Twitter how Black people are not allowed to have childhoods because it's only been less than 200 years where a Black child was either seen as labor, curiosity, or entertainment. They don't have a childhood. The irony about Black males in the West is that you're born and you can work. You never become a man, you're a boy, right? But you're also never a baby. That's, you know, and for Black women, the same thing. And because Black men are seen as, are portrayed as beastly, ironically, it means that Black women are seen as extraordinarily strong because clearly they live with us and we must be beating them and they're surviving. So there's all of these, you know, like really weird things going on in the context of the West. The unspoken stuff that's there is like incredible, and it's so much. And people are unaware of these things. You know, the number of times people will come up to a Black person and say, "You're so eloquent." Am I not supposed to be? I'm grown, I'm full grown. What am I supposed to have been doing in my life? And this is where the whole boy thing comes in. It's like, this is a child. They're not supposed, like, you know, and people feel like they're doing you a favor or paying you a compliment, you know? So yeah, it's a very complex dynamic. I don't even remember what I was talking about, but these things happen. But yeah, so I think performance is about respect. And the reason why I'm really inspired by musicians is because there is no way you can have a good band if you don't listen. And I think that if you are a writer and you're sharing work, you have to be listening to the audience. Otherwise, you're not going to land. So.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I'm enjoying they're not tangents, it all flows. It's great. So I'm going to open up to questions from our attendees. But I am cheekily gonna insert just a final question about you know, your exploration of the blurred lines between age and youth, and you kind of touched upon sort of, you know, the Black woman and Black man's experiences, if you will, or lack of childhood. Is there any wisdom you can share with us? Barbara, you know, beautifully really brought some light into our discussion and talked about sort of not being ageist, but in her age, how she's become, I guess, less cynical, less jaded, more curious, less bored by, I guess, life.
I mean, I'll say that I see a lot of things wrong, but I don't let them hold me down, right? And I think that's the closest thing to joy that you can experience. So like, I'm about savoring stuff, you know, like whether it's food, whether it's music. I know I walk out there and there's something going on, but if I carry it with me in a place that's relentless, then I'm never going to know joy, right? And so, you know, when I talked about that line of what's seen in this whole midlife crisis thing, my father died when he was 50, right? I'm 48 now. So I think midlife crisis is less about age and more about experiences that happen. So at that point in my life when I was writing The Gaze, I had left a relationship that wasn't good for me. I mean, I think my ex is a wonderful woman. She's just not right for me, or we're not right for each other. I don't know. I'm the one who left, so she was very mad at me. But and I think also because I didn't. Yeah. Anyway, that's by the by. I think she's an amazing woman. I'm not with her anymore. But what happened at that point is I was living by myself in Wales, and everybody had this thing of, oh, you know, some of the students thought I was a student with them. And it's like, you know, I'm always smiling. So people are like, oh, there's all this. And yet what I was reeling from was this thing. I've wanted to be a father since I was 14. And so suddenly here I am, I'm in my 40s, and I've rented a house that's supposed to have my entire family, and it's empty, right? And I walk through the hallways and I can hear my footsteps. And so what people were seeing was this happy-go-lucky person they assumed was in their 20s, but I was in my 40s, and I was literally grieving the fact that the dream I'd held since I was like a young boy was no longer a possible thing, and I had to kind of learn to live with that, right? And so that's what The Gaze was about. And you know, so PJ's just asked about photography. I used to be a photographer's assistant for my uncle in Ghana, and so one of the things I started to do was just take photographs, you know, just find ways. Like I said, I look for joy. So I was just looking for the things that would make me happy. And, you know, I went to photography. And so that's when I ended up doing the series, part of which became the cover of the collection and stuff like that. So yeah, you know, it's just about that thing of people see one thing and the whole Black Don't Crackedness of it. And then the whole kind of historical boy address and all of that stuff, you know. So yeah, it's a lot.
PJ Sam asked a question earlier about, again, artwork. How much autonomy did you have over the cover?
Quite a lot. I mean, one of the things I love about Peepal Tree is that there's dialogue. I mean, obviously they understand that the collection is a work of initially of gathering, but then beyond that, there's a kind of creation that goes on. And so when the covers are being worked on, there's a dialogue over what, you know. So even for my first book, The Makings of You, again, I wanted a photograph of a schoolyard. And I wanted it from a tropical country. I actually wanted it from Ghana. I wanted my cousin to go and take the photograph, but the place I grew up in is not the same anymore, right? So the schoolyard doesn't look like the schoolyard. But I found this photograph of a schoolyard in the Caribbean, and it looked right because it's the same kind of, again, when you're in a hot place, the way the light refracts is different. So you can tell that the picture's been taken in a hot place, right? So we use that. And with this one, when I sent the collection, I said, hey, I've been taking these photographs which have inspired some of the work. So it's probably going to be one of them. I'm going to work on it. So I had almost complete autonomy on the cover. Yeah.
Repeat B had a question earlier. What role do you see Pidgin and Creole languages playing in Pan-African knowledge sharing?
I think it already plays an important part, because if you move across West Africa, it's a kind of lingua franca already. And what happens is when we cross borders, we shift the vocabulary according to local spaces. And it is one of the most dynamic, these are some of the most dynamic languages in the world. They change daily. The references are always increasing. You go and you've been away for a year and you go back, people can tell you've been away for a year because there are new terms and you're not up to scratch. And I know that, you know, my dear friend Ainsley Burrows, who's Jamaican, he says when he goes back to Jamaica, even, you know, the patois sometimes it's like it's changed. It's like he's not current. So yeah, and because of our ability to pick up and move with these expressions, it will always be important in knowledge sharing, because some of that knowledge is the change in language. The changes in language reflects things that are happening. So part of that is knowledge sharing. But I also feel like, and we have a kind of migration from the Caribbean into Africa at the moment. And we find that these are becoming easy ways for us to kind of share outside of standard English. So yeah, I think the role they play will depend on how much dialogue we have, but you can see it in music as well already. Music very often leads the way in showing us how our dialogues will happen across, you know, the borders of the diasporas, the various diasporas.
Definitely, I agree. The shift in the cultural moment that is captured in a lot of recent music. Repeat But Beat Poet follows up referring to Aimé Césaire, has the idea about the boomerang of colonialism, what's done to the colonial subject, what will be done to the imperial citizen. Do you think there'll be a boomerang of liberation, emancipation, and where does poetry hold place in that?
Yeah, I mean, the funny thing about these things is that it's like a boomerang that doesn't stop. So it moves and it goes about, because we've seen these movements, right? When the African liberation struggles were happening, in England, you had the working class agitating. You had women agitating for, you know, better rights at work and stuff like that. So whenever there's struggle somewhere and people witness a struggle, they also think about how they're being disenfranchised in some way, because it, you know, it ticks a box, or it doesn't tick a box. It opens a box, because you see that somebody's speaking about their struggle, and then it gives you the impetus to talk about your struggle. Sometimes the courage. You know, sometimes you see people doing like really incredible things. Look at the way that the Arab Spring spread, right? It's because people saw, hey, if this person is willing to burn themselves for freedom, I'm going to go on the street. And it wasn't like they're saying, I'm going to go and burn as well. But it's like, no, if that's what freedom is worth, right? And so these things happen. Poetry's place is, I think poetry is normally the first mouthpiece of any struggle. You know, when you see placards, very often there's a line of poetry there somewhere. You know, what's happening with the, you know, I had a conversation with Wassan Shire, and she, or maybe it's also in her interview, one of her recent interviews, and she talks about when she wrote Nobody Leaves Home. She was thinking primarily about Black bodies, and she, as much as she can see that is relevant in the struggles of other peoples who are going forced into exile, it's strange how it's been appropriated, because it's used mainly in reference to refugees who are not dark-skinned. You know, the articles come and it's about Ukraine, it's about Syria. Yes, they're all refugees, and we feel for them. But when she wrote, she was writing about, you know, Somali people in Italy. You know, so this is to say that you can't stop poetry from being the mouthpiece of struggle and emancipation and liberation, regardless of where it is. It almost breaks free of its origin. It breaks free of its conception, and it becomes something else. And this is how, when we write, we lose control of the narrative. So, you know, you inspire something, and then it takes on a life of its own. And poetry is uniquely suited for that because it's not. It can be non-narrative, so it can be a flag, rather than building walls. It's literally a flag. It goes in the wind like this. Whereas sometimes narrative is a wall and it doesn't move. Poetry is a flag, and so it can carry in the wind, and it goes and it plays its part, which is why, you know, in places like Latin America, poetry is spoken in the streets. In India, spoken in the streets. I mean, even in Ghana, the traditional songs, and also the high life songs, people quote all the time. You know, like, you know, there's a phrase I use all the time that I heard in the high life song when I was like 9 years old, which is "Yebewuntienda," which means should we not sleep because we know we're about to die? So the fact we know we're about to die doesn't mean we shouldn't sleep, right? We can't be worried about it. Like, so that's poetry's place. We carry it with us.
Yeah, beautifully said. Final question from Hannah. She said that she was discussing your collection with her book club, is it? Your reading group the other day. She says she'd like to know whether you were thinking of Chekhov when he wrote about the bottle reflecting the light of the moon. He suggested instead of describing moonlight, a writer shows it by mentioning the neck of a bottle glinting instead.
I wasn't thinking about Chekhov. I mean, I wasn't thinking about Chekhov. I mean, I think I'm influenced by things that I read, but I don't consciously go to take from something when I'm creating. I live in a creative space where I acknowledge that I'm influenced by lots of things. But also there's a lot of poetry in so for instance, in my language, in Ga, you know, if you want to say the sun is shining, you know, or the sun's really hot, you say the sun has opened its mouth, right? So there's lots of poetry in the languages that are going on in my head, and they all have oblique ways of describing things, and I think I'm influenced by that. That oblique way of describing things, of kind of taking someone somewhere without them noticing. I even do it in the kitchen. I realized when, you know, my mom lived with me just after I graduated, and I used to get really upset when I was cooking and she'd come in the kitchen. And I didn't understand it until I realized that I actually like surprising her. So I didn't want her to come and see what I was doing. I wanted my ingredients to be, you know, different, secret, whatever. And I think I write in the same way. So the obliqueness is about like leading someone to a place without like throwing it in their face. It's like, oh, there you go. There's the plant you were looking for. Yeah, so I think it's probably more to do with that.
Great. Thank you so much, Nii, and thank you to everyone for the questions. When you're ready, we're going to hear a reading by Nii now.
Okay, so I think, yeah, we'll read Ballad for Western Girls Who Want the Rainbow, just because I haven't read it before to an audience. Western girl, your city has taught you to hate the kind of men you fall for. Pictures of them flash on local news cycles every night when newsreaders' lips are twisted by crime into shapes, never full glass but colored stem. Pale news tongues never mention the melting of shea butter in dark male hands, fingers in grandmother's hair, The posters of Paddington Bear that they haven't removed from their walls since the age of 7. How they hum love songs off key, the nails they bite when nervous. They've debated the shots of Simbene Usmane and Kurosawa, read the words of Giovanni and Auden, played around with fistfuls of chopped coriander to render simple meals great. But the papers won't mention those things. Those headlines you get that label boys as men and men as boys and boys as scourges, mark them out as threats by sly leans of language. You know that's truth bent. You've seen these men's tears, but come crunch time, you still see what you've been taught, what you desire. Their bodies, those vessels with shades of darker for skin, with muscle, with muscle, with muscle within, with muscle, with muscle, with muscle and sin. And you forget the epicardium, its sublayers, the spaces it cradles within, its pockets of fear. Okay. My poems are short. I should be able to do How I Know. So there's a song by the RH Factor, and you should go and listen to the RH Factor after this if you can, because really amazing. Roy Hargrove. It's a Roy Hargrove project. I smile a little more than I did before. That's how I know love. That's a line from one of the song called How I Know. I have a lot of poems titled after songs, actually. And obviously my first collection is the title of a Curtis Mayfield song, The Makings of You, which is a very beautiful song indeed. How I Know. Some memory of darkness, soft expanses of ebony, and flesh that turned liquid on my tongue in the clasp of infant gums. A body that moved to soothe me, a body with shoulders angled to support leaning. Notes hidden like silverfish in the creases of my books, 6-year-old fingers turning care-perfect Ds. Surprise declarations that drop out on stages, reminding me that I've birthed a girl with heart, a child who knows healing. The smell of almond and shea butter in the hair of an embrace, the sound of trains passing, a glut of air as tunnels fill with weight, slow breath as I try to hold a moment that feels like one that shouldn't pass. We're skin to skin at the cheek. A boy's smile that emerges as his mother's door closes, his hands reaching for the learned angle of my shoulders, the circumference of my neck soon in the clasp of his thighs, monkey bar antics fading as a girl warms my cheek with her small hand. This is how my dad felt, perhaps. All I remember is fleeting, but I recall the scratch of a pin on shellac, the wound of Mahalia's voice rising to fill a house, the weight of his arm around my neck, the whisper of a smile moving the wood of his skin, his voice saying, listen. In the poetry section of the bookshop, my hand in the crease of an anthology of Brazilian poets, lost in the black joy of word after apt word, I lift my eyes and see the woman who said yes to dinner. She moves and my mouth is wide. Between us, a field of teeth straining to do more than just smile. Okay. I will read a section from, well, 2 sections from Caress. The first section, so that's page 47. And yeah, I'll read page 47, page 55. Caress. 1. If I speak often of gardening and day's slow rise behind the creep of morning sun, it is because somewhere along my thigh lies the memory of a tomato plant's jagged leaf nibbling at my skin at dawn. Your hand steady at my shoulder, your voice gentle in my ear, pointing out tiny buds that will turn to flower, then fruit. I hold the faded watering can, its silver sharp against my grip, dark as yours as we wade between beds of onion and kale, lettuce both green and red, aubergines that stand high as my chest, and all the while time unfurls. Birds bicker in the guava tree behind us, doors crack open, the light spreads, its luster caressing your tight curls as you pull a radish clean out of the soil. Shake it and bite through its red skin to the crunch of its white flesh, passing one half to me. We speak nothing, Okomfo, of origins, but I know you planted all these seeds and taught me the tender and the harsh, the art of nurturing them. And this is all I needed to know of love, ever. A morning before sun, the beauty of bud, flower, and fruit, a father's voice with bird song, the tart white secrets in a radish's heart. Seven. One child I planted tomatoes with because for a time there was a patch of gardening space and sun. Another spoke beautifully with my tongue, his eyes set in his grandfather's face. A third held me by the mouth, kissed me, caressed my cheek and said, "Daddy," making my heart thud at dawn each time I remember. There are songs I have sung to all my children, words I stole from tunes shaped in the mouth of my mother. Thus, the body is echo chamber and memory, all its parts triggers, every bruise history, melody. I carry all my dreams, not as I imagined, but the heft holds. Every flower has fallen to yield some peculiar fruit. Thank you. I thought I'd leave a couple of minutes in case anyone had any questions. So.
Thank you, Nii.
Thank you.
Yes, we have 5 minutes.
And thanks to everyone for being here on this beautiful Friday evening when you could have started your drinking.
Hannah says, amazing to hear you read your work, Nii, so moving. Yeah, I second that. Yeah, I think used to say we haven't started yet.
Yes, indeed.
Good one. Yeah, I guess we'll leave it on that note.
So yeah, for those of you who haven't read the book, I hope that you enjoy it when you do. Yeah, it's been lovely to kind of be here.
No, thank you for doing this. If I'm just going to pop my email below, email me and I can send you a free copy because you joined, and 20% off any other book purchase. I recommend The Makings of You. Yeah, have a great night. Thank you, Nii. This will be on YouTube. Follow us on our socials at Peepal Tree Press on Twitter and Instagram, and follow our book club account at PTP Book Club. Take care. Hopefully see you all soon. And yeah, thanks again, Nii. My email. There you go.
Thank you.
See you all later. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Barbara. Take care. Hope you get better and you're resting up. Great. I'm glad you came back. No bother.
Thank you, Anna. Bye. Nice to meet you.
You too. Take care. Bye now.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Great. I'm glad you enjoyed. I thought you would. Okay, so yeah, take care. See you very soon, Barbara. Bye now.